On November 27, 1874, a British ship picked up a lifeboat adrift just south of the Cape of Good Hope. Inside were three men close to death. Once on board, the survivors would tell first-hand accounts of the horrifying tragedy that would put fear in the hearts of even the most seasoned sailors. This is the story of the burning of the immigrant ship Cospatrick. For centuries, East Indiaman ships dominated trade routes between England and the East Indies. But by the mid-19th century, they were slow, outdated, and costly to maintain. Blackwall frigates, by contrast, were faster, sturdier, and built to withstand the harsh conditions of long-distance voyages. The Cospatrick was one such three-masted Blackwall frigate. Launched in 1856 in Burma, she spent years carrying cargo between England and India. She was commissioned by Duncan Dunbar, one of London's prominent ship owners. Dunbar was a major figure in global trade, owned a vast fleet, was known for his ventures across the British Empire's busiest shipping lanes. For several years, the Cospatrick operated on the England-India route, transporting valuable cargo across thousands of miles of open sea. In 1862, with the passing of Duncan Dunbar, the Cospatrick entered a new era. The ship was sold to Smith, Fleming and Company, which kept it busy on familiar routes between England and India. But the Cospatrick wasn't limited to trade alone. It also made 2 voyages to Australia, carrying not just cargo, but soldiers and immigrants, men and women chasing opportunity on the other side of the world. Then, in 1873, the ship changed hands once more. Its new owners, Shaw, Saville and Company, were experts in a different kind of voyage. One not driven by trade, but by people. The Cospatrick was then placed on the England to New Zealand route, a journey that promised new beginnings for thousands of immigrants seeking a fresh start. But this was more than just a business venture. By 1874, the Cospatrick had a new mission, transporting immigrants to New Zealand, part of a push to populate the colony with skilled workers and farmers. And with it came hundreds of passengers, each carrying their hopes, dreams, and fate aboard one ill-fated ship. The 1870s were a difficult time for many in the United Kingdom. An agricultural depression had left farms struggling, pushing thousands into poverty. For many families, there were few options: stay and face an uncertain future, or leave in search of something better. And so they left. Some sailed for the United States, others to Canada or Australia, but for many, the promise of a fresh start lay in New Zealand. At that time, New Zealand was desperate for settlers. The land was plentiful, but there weren't enough people to work it. The government actively encouraged immigration, offering incentives. Some families were even giving free passage in exchange for their labor, and Cospatrick was ready to bring them. In 1873, Cospatrick under new owners, the ship made its first voyage to New Zealand, arriving in Otago after 108 days at sea. That journey carried mostly cargo with only a small number of immigrants on board. After a brief stay, the Cospatrick returned to England, docking at Gravesend in July 1874. A few months later, on September 11, 1874, the Cospatrick set sail once again. This time, it wasn't just carrying goods, it was packed with people. Nearly 500 passengers and crew boarded the ship, bound for Auckland. Most were laborers, farmers, eager to rebuild their lives in a new land. Families carrying all they owned stepped aboard, leaving behind everything familiar in the hope of something better. Among them were also 41 crew members, each tasked with ensuring a safe passage. Some had experience in the New Zealand route, while others had sailed on different trade missions. Their captain, Alexander Elmsley, was a seasoned mariner who had spent years navigating the world's oceans. This voyage, however, was different. He wouldn't be traveling alone. His wife and son were with him on board. The journey ahead would take several months. The passengers and crew braced themselves for the long weeks without sight of land, the unpredictable weather, and the ever-present dangers of the open sea. For now, everything seemed normal. The Cospatrick sailed smoothly, her sails filled the wind, as England disappeared behind the horizon. Families settled into their cramped quarters, hopeful and expectant. However, they did not know that this would be their final voyage. For the first 2 months, life on the Cospatrick felt routine. Calm seas, friendly conversations paired with games and fun activities. Days were spent looking at the beautiful ocean. Evenings were filled with the gentle sounds of the sea. But this calm and peace didn't last for longer. Everything changed on the dreaded night of November 17. The Cospatrick was about 740 kilometers southwest of the Cape of Good Hope near Cape Town when disaster struck. That night, Henry MacDonald, the second mate, was asleep in his cabin. He woke up to the sound of people shouting fire. Henry rushed outside with his chest pounding. He saw the front part of the ship was in flames. The fire had already spread across a large section of the deck. Captain Elmsley quickly gave orders to try and put out the fire. He told Henry and the rest of the crew to start pumping water. The crew did their best, but the fire kept growing. It had started in the forward cargo area where flammable materials were stored. This included alcohol and tar. The fire spread too fast for the pumps to control it. The crew threw water at the flames, but it was not enough. Captain Elmsley tried to turn the ship before the wind. He hoped that this would keep the fire contained in the forward section. But by doing this, 2 of the lifeboats at the front of the ship were destroyed by the flames. The fire had trapped passengers and crew. Henry MacDonald went to the captain and asked if they should lower the remaining lifeboats. The captain said no. He ordered everyone to keep fighting the fire. But the situation was getting worse. People were desperate. Some of them took matters into their own hands. Passengers and crew rushed to the remaining lifeboats. They tried to launch one of the starboard side, but too many people climbed in at once. The lifeboat flipped over and fell into the ocean. The people inside it drowned. By now, the fire had spread across most of the ship. The heat was unbearable. Smoke filled the air, making it hard to breathe. The passengers were panicking. Captain Elmsley saw that there was no hope of saving the ship. He gave the final order, every man for himself. Lifeboats weren't assigned based on how many people were aboard. Instead, they were based on the ship's overall tonnage. There were almost 500 people on the Cospatrick, which meant most would not have a place in a lifeboat. For most, there would be no room, no chance. There was no rule of women and children first. There were scenes of panic and desperation everywhere. Crew members shoved past passengers. Families were torn apart in the scramble for survival. In 19th century England, swimming was not a common skill, which is why most people on board did not know how to swim. When people jumped into the ocean, many drowned right away. The waves pulled them under. Others tried to hold onto floating debris. Henry MacDonald and some of the crew managed to launch a lifeboat from the port side. Crew members jumped in. They paddled away from the burning ship. Captain Elmsley was last seen jumping into the water with his wife, son, and the ship's doctor. None of them were ever seen again. As Henry and the crew drifted away, they noticed another lifeboat. Some sailors had righted the lifeboat back over. They had a few passengers inside. But the boat had no oars, making it hard to control. Henry made a decision. He told his crew to row over to the other lifeboat. They tied the 2 boats together. In total, there were over 60 people in the 2 lifeboats. They had escaped the burning ship, but they were not safe. Still, they needed supplies to survive. They tried to get close to the Cospatrick to salvage food and water, but by now the fire had taken over the entire ship. The remaining survivors were still clinging to the wreckage. If the lifeboats got too close, people in the water would try to climb in, which could cause the boats to capsize. Henry and the others had no choice but to stay back. They had nothing with them. No food, no water, no shelter. For the next 2 days, they stayed near the Cospatrick, hoping to find something useful. They watched as the fire continued to consume the ship. The once great vessel was now a floating inferno. Finally, on November 19, the Cospatrick sank beneath the waves. The survivors were now alone in the open ocean. The fire was gone, but the nightmare had only just begun. The survivors floated in the vast empty ocean, no sails on the horizon, no land in sight. Just two lifeboats, 60 people, and nothing else. The survivors in the lifeboats had no food or water. They also did not have a compass or a map. They could only guess the direction of Africa and tried to sail towards it. Between the two lifeboats, they only had one oar. Rowing was slow and exhausting. The days were scorching hot and the nights were freezing cold. They rowed for 2 days, hoping to see land or a passing ship. On November 22nd, a strong gale struck. The waves grew larger and the wind howled around them. The lifeboats struggled to stay together. Eventually, the lifeboat on the port side was separated. The survivors in the other lifeboat was never seen again. Henry MacDonald kept a daily log. On November 22nd, he wrote that they were starting to feel extreme thirst. Some men, unable to bear it any longer, drank salt water. Soon after, they became sick and died. As the days passed, more people died from thirst and exposure. The survivors became weak. The heat of the day drained their strength, and the cold at night made it worse. Soon, the survivors became desperate. They resorted to cannibalism. Henry wrote in his log, "We were so thirsty and hungry that we had to drink the blood and eat the liver of 2 dead people." They had no choice. Drinking the blood of the dead gave them some relief from thirst. The liver provided some nourishment. When there were no bodies left, they resorted to drinking salt water again. This pattern continued for days. The survivors barely had energy to move. Some were too weak to sit up. They simply lay in the bottom of the lifeboat, waiting for death. By Friday, November 27, 10 days after the Cospatrick caught fire, only 7 people were left in the lifeboat. Later that day, 2 of them died. The others tried to throw the bodies overboard, but they were so weak they could only manage to throw one. The other body remained in the boat with them. The survivors had no hope left. They lay there, barely alive, waiting for the end. Then, a miracle happened. A British ship, the Scepter, was sailing from Calcutta to Scotland when the crew spotted the lifeboat. The 5 remaining survivors were taken aboard. They were given food and water, but their bodies had been pushed to the limit. 2 of the 5 survivors died shortly after being rescued. Out of all the 500 people on the Cospatrick, only 3 survived. They were Henry MacDonald, Thomas Lewis, and Edward Cotter. The Scepter took them to safety. They were later transferred to a steamship that brought them back to England. In February 1875, a Board of Trade inquiry was held to determine the cause of the disaster. At first, they thought the fire had started in the boatswain's locker. The boatswain was the officer in charge of equipment on the ship. But after hearing from experts, the inquiry reached a different conclusion. The fire most likely started in the cargo hold, where alcohol and other flammable materials were stored. It was common for passengers or crew members to sneak into the hold to steal alcohol. Since the journey was long and boring, some may have been tempted. They might have used candles for light. At some point, one of these candles likely set fire to the cargo. The dry and flammable materials caused the fire to spread quickly. The inquiry also pointed out other problems. The cargo had not been properly secured. This allowed people to sneak in and create a dangerous situation. Another issue was the lack of lifeboats. The ship carried almost 500 people, but the lifeboats could only hold 180. At that time, lifeboat requirements were based on the ship's tonnage, not on how many people were on board. The Cospatrick also lacked proper fire drills. If there had been better preparation, more people might have survived. Despite the massive loss of life, the inquiry did not make major changes. Instead, it only recommended that ship owners improve security in cargo holds and carry more lifeboats. Depending on who you ask or what sources you read, this event is considered one of the worst, if not the worst, disaster in New Zealand's history. If you made it all the way to the end, thank you. I put in a lot of effort into my videos, and although my videos don't have the same quality as bigger, more established channels, I truly aim to give you the best experience possible. I would really appreciate it if you can like and subscribe to my channel so that one day I can offer you a much better experience. Again, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.